Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode of the CRM Inbox series, we're going to finish refining our designs in Figma by completing our reply pane. So here in Figma, where we left off on the last episode, we created the message detail thread when you expand and open a message that you would like to read. The final thing to work on is this reply panel, where you can compose a reply or a new message. Looking at our component inventory, you can see that we just have some nested elements inside of here. But if we look at the visual reference, everything should be existing components, so this should go pretty quickly. The first thing I'm going to do is copy out this reference. We'll go over to our molecules page, and let's paste it in somewhere here. I'm going to create a frame off to the side that we can work from, and this will be reply for the dark theme. We'll change the fill to main background dark. Now let's get a rough sense of the sizing that we're going for. So in our reference, we have 900 pixels width. To stick with our 8 pixel grid a little better, let's go for a target width of 880. So let's drag out a frame using the F key, and let's set its width to be 880 wide. For the height now, let's just rough it out to be around 400. We can figure that out once our layout is settled. The reply pane is going to have a corner radius of 16 pixels. And for the fill, let's use elevation 2 for the dark theme. All right, with that taken care of, we can get it roughly positioned in our documentation here. Now let's start dragging in some of the components that we'll need for this. So we have our typography, we have icon buttons that I see, the small avatars, our drop-down trigger button, and this primary CTA. Going into our assets panel, let's first grab our avatars. So we have a small avatar. We're also going to have our primary icon button. So let's drag that into place. On top of that, we have a regular icon for our attachment section, which you can barely see here due to the low contrast issues. Next up, going into our molecules, let's grab a default icon button. And let's just search for the drop-down trigger. So we have the default state there. I believe that's everything we need to build this component, so let's get right into it. So first up, we want our reply subject. So how are you getting on? And let's set this to be high contrast for the dark theme. And the type spec, let's do a title 1. Let's get this spaced 32 pixels within our component here. Next up, we have the reply title. And I think I want to set this to be body micro. Let's make sure this is medium contrast for the dark theme. And we should be sure to name our elements as we go. So this was the reply subject. And let's call this the reply field label. All right, our avatar is going to follow that. For the spacing between these, let's say that's going to be 16 pixels as a start. These will be left aligned. And in just a moment, we'll figure out the vertical spacing that we're looking for. Next up, we need the recipient name. So this will be Dribbble team. This will be high contrast. And let's say body strong. Get it vertically aligned with these neighboring elements. And let's set it to be 8 pixels away from the avatar. Okay, next up we have our group of other recipients, people who would be CC'd on the email. Let's maybe place them 24 pixels away. And we're going to need multiple copies here so that we have 4 total. If we look at a reference, the stacking order is that the rightmost is on top. So we'll have to replicate that with our layer order here. So this topmost layer, drag out to the right. And then we'll just keep dragging out these elements roughly for now. With these 4, we can select them, distribute the horizontal spacing, and set it to be -4 pixels to match the same layout that we created in our messages, if we reference these here. Let's group these with Control or Command G, and let's call this reply recipients. While we're at it, the Dribbble team layer is going to be reply, and this will just be the main recipient. Moving along, it looks like we need this add recipient button. So we should be able to grab a copy of our icon button, and in its nested layer, let's swap this over to be add recipient. And I'm not seeing it here, so we might actually have to make this icon real quick. We must have missed this in our previous episode. So we have a dotted circle border with a plus icon. So let's go back into our atoms page and let's add a new icon to our icon drafts. All right, so we have this visual boundary for all of our consistent icons. I'm going to copy this first instance. Let's paste it down to fall in the last position of this grid. So this will be our add recipient icon. And let's start stubbing out some of these details. First thing, I'm going to hit O for the oval tool, and holding Shift and Alt, drag out from the center. This is going to have no fill. The stroke is going to be 1 pixel. For now, let's make it high contrast for the dark theme. And inside of our advanced stroke options, let's try something for dashes around 4 pixel width and 4 pixel gap. We have nice symmetry along the X and Y axis, so let's try this out. I believe we have some other plus icons we can reference here. So let's perhaps grab this one here and paste it inside. Zooming out, I think that looks all right, but the ends of this plus symbol are a little too tight around this dotted border. So let's modify this slightly. While we're here, let's go hunting for that ellipse that we created earlier. We can ungroup this plus icon with Control or Command, Shift, and G. And let's modify these 2 shapes. So instead of 16, let's maybe bring this down to 12 in each direction and see how we feel about that. We can grab these, center them up. And I think that looks much better. All right, so we have our draft completed. Let's copy this, go into our finalized section here. We'll paste it in. It already snaps into place. And this is where we componentize everything. We want to keep our drafts separate from where our components live. That way, if we ever need to make changes, we have all of our live paths that are separate from our more optimized vector paths. So grabbing this, we want to make a union between the plus symbol elements. We can flatten this with Control or Command E. Let's do the same for our ellipse. We're going to right click and outline stroke. Take these 2 elements, make a union, and we can flatten this one last time. So this will be the icon, add recipient, and this is the icon portion. The icon plate is something that we don't need in the final component, so we can componentize this. And let's rename it to be icon dark default add recipient. While we're here, we need to copy this over and make our light variation. Drag this down in the layers panel. And the only change is swapping the high contrast dark for the white variation. Recomponentize and rename. So this will be icon light default. All right, we can zoom to fit by hitting 1. And with Alt or Option and L, we can collapse our layers. Going back to our molecules page, let's go into this nested layer for our icon button. And now we have Add Recipient as an option. In our design, we want this to be medium contrast for this implementation. And now we have our icon button. Let's tuck this in to be around 8 pixels away from our recipient list. Okay, looking good. One thing we forgot to do is add this expand to full screen button. So while we're working on icon buttons, let's drag out a copy and swap this out for expand. All right, so we want this to be 32 and 32 away from the edges of our component. That's looking good. One thing I might do is visually center the title with the icon button. So let's grab this and get it centered up. Just fixing our spacing here real quick. That's looking good. All right, so let's grab this whole chunk of content here. We want to get that Add Recipient button as well. And using Control-Command-G, let's group this and call it Reply. And this will be the CC section of our reply component. Now we can figure out vertical spacing. So off of this button up here, let's try maybe 16 pixels. And we might come back to this and add a little more spacing in just a moment. Moving on, we have the actual text area of our reply, so we can start building that out. So it looks like we had a 20 pixel radius. And we have a little bit random padding in our design reference. So we want to clean that up. So inside of here, I'm going to drag out a nested frame. And this should match the left and right padding of the overall component. This frame will have that 20 pixel corner radius. And for a fill, we might have to create something custom. One challenge that we're seeing here is with our existing background colors, the contrast really falls off at the bottom of this gradient. So we may have to make a darker variation that we can use specifically for this more inset input case. So one idea that comes to mind is let's grab the elevation 2 gradient. We'll detach this and adjust the start and end points here. So by default, our HSL value is 234 for the hue, 11 for the saturation, and let's just nudge this lightness value down by 10 percentage points. We'll do the same thing for our stop point, so from 29 to 19. Now we have really strong contrast within this gradient, but we still match that same look. So with this, we can add this as a new color style. So let's call it elevation 2. And this will be the Inset Gradient for the dark theme. So with that, we can start getting some of these other elements in place. We have our drop-down trigger, the microphone icon for voice input, and the actual message content. Hitting T, let's say type something as our placeholder text. Let's change this to be body default, and the fill can be medium contrast for the dark theme. In terms of spacing, 32 is looking good on the left and right. Let's maybe tuck this up to be 16. And we might want more breathing room inside of here. I think I want perhaps 64 pixels of spacing between the placeholder text and these options within the reply pane. So with that in mind, let's base our spacing off of these elements here. The drop-down trigger and icon button should be vertically centered. And then we can grab our outer frame, snap it to the bottom edge, and then using Control Command plus Shift, we can nudge this down 1, 2 spaces for an overall padding of 16 vertically. With our icon button, we want to swap this icon over to microphone. That's looking good. And I'm really liking the new styling that we're bringing to this component. This spacing feels a little bit floaty though, so maybe we can focus on layout constraints now. While we're at it, let's rename some of these layers. So this will be the reply body, and this will be the placeholder text. And these other elements are already components, so we can leave those alone. The reply body placeholder will have a left and top constraint. This drop-down trigger will be left and bottom. And this microphone will be pinned to the bottom and the right as well. So right now we have 64 pixels spacing between these. I'm actually going to hit Control Command plus Shift, and using the up key, let's tuck this in and see what looks good. So maybe bringing it down to 48 pixels seems to feel best. All right, let's rename this frame to be the reply body, and we can keep moving along. So I'm going to drag this to follow the CC section, and let's make sure the spacing between these looks good as well. So that's 32. We might want to bring it down to around 24. Or maybe 16. That's looking better. All right, last thing is we have some of these other elements here. I think the overall height of this needs to increase. This primary call to action button can be 32 and 32 away from the bottom right corner, so we can set its constraints. Next up, we have a very similar treatment with our attachment footer that we do in our message thread. So maybe a good starting point is to just copy this over. And I think ideally we might want to componentize this, but since we're only grabbing a couple assets for now, we can maybe leave that for future improvement. So I'm going to copy this over, paste it inside of our reply pane, and we can adjust things as needed. So one change is that we only have one button as part of the action, and we don't have any previews shown in this collapse state of the attachment footer. First thing, I believe this icon button that we're looking for is the small variant. So let's go to default. Yep, and this would be the caret icon to show that this accordion is collapsed. Let's get all these vertically centered. Spacing is looking good there. Only consideration is that this will be full width of the component, so let's adjust that. I might actually convert this to be a frame, and that way the spacing between these elements and this horizontal rule are all intact. Hitting Control Command plus Alt or Option and G. Let's convert this to a frame. We might have to actually get rid of this nested group layer. We can call this the reply attachment. And let's work on some of the layout constraints. So the icon and attachment label, we want to be left and center. The attachment rule will be pinned left, right, and center. And this icon button should be pinned to the right and center. Now we can simply adjust the width of this section, and all our layout should be preserved. All right, let's get our vertical spacing established. Let's maybe try 32 pixels there. With that, let's adjust our outer frame. So that way we have the vertical spacing between the send button and this attachment section. So right now we're at 57. Let's maybe tuck this down by 9 pixels, bringing it down to a height of 512. And looking at this at a distance, I think everything is a little too spaced out. So let's go in and refine things a little further. We can also rearrange our layers here. So this CC section, I want to bring it up 8 pixels so it's a little more visually grouped with the title of the email. The reply body looks good, around 16 pixels there, but maybe the vertical height of this element is a little too much. So looking at these bottom 2 elements, we have 48 pixels. Instead of 48, let's hit Control-Command plus Shift, nudge it up twice, and give it a spacing of 32. I think that looks better. This attachment section, let's put that around 32. And we'll want the same for our send button here. So right now our send button is at 72. So we need to reduce the height of this by 40 pixels. So here I'm going to hit Shift and down 5 times. And I think that's the spacing we're looking for. All right, everything is looking good. Let's rename this to reply dark, and we're ready to componentize. We're done with our reference, so we can drag out a copy. Get these rearranged in our layers panel. This copy is going to be for the white theme, main background light, and let's start retheming. All right, so we have mostly everything rethemed here, but I stopped on this reply body because we need to create an inset gradient that better suits our light theming. So as a starting place, we can simply change this over to be elevation 2 gradient, and that'll match our background, but obviously there's no contrast here. Let's break this instance and change the start and end points here. So our hue actually needs to be 234. We have 27, and let's just adjust this lightness until it starts to come into visibility. I think that's looking good. Grabbing our endpoint, let's do the same. So adjusting that hue again, 234. We have a saturation of 26, and let's adjust this down 4 percentage points as well. All right, let's retheme the nested contents and then see how we feel about this. I think that's subtle enough to work, where it preserves our color contrast, but has enough surrounding contrast so you can tell that this is an input. All right, so with those, I'm going to hit Alt or Option L to collapse these layers, and we're ready to recomponentize this and rename it to be Reply Light. The one thing I forgot to do is add a drop shadow to this component. So on the original instance of Reply Dark, let's go to Effects, and we should have some elevations that we can choose from. So we have Elevation 2 Dark. If we look at this in the context of our design, this reply pane sits on top of everything else. So to create that visual distance, feeling like it's closer to the viewer, we probably need a distinct box shadow that is much more spread out to give it the layered effect that we're going for. So going back to this, we'll start with our Elevation 2, but let's detach this style and work on it further. I think having this nice crisp line works well still. I might want to bring this down a few percentage points though. And let's really increase the blur so that way it has a nice floaty feel to it. I'm actually going to increase this quite a bit. Maybe just something around 128. And I might increase the opacity as well. So let's start with something like 50%. And we might need more Y spread as well. That's looking pretty good. One thing that might help us out is to go to our pages, and in this refined design, let's delete this rough example and drag in our new component. Under molecules, we have reply dark. Let's drag this into place. And let's get it spaced out, maybe to be 64 from each edge. All right, I think that box shadow is working well, so I'm happy with that for now. Let's not forget to add this as an effect style. So we'll call this elevation 3. This will be for the dark theme. With our light variation, we obviously want to customize this drop shadow so it's not quite so harsh. So going into our nested instance, we'll detach from elevation 3 for the dark theme, and let's start adjusting this. First thing is I think this opacity needs to go way down for both of these. So let's maybe adjust this somewhere around 6. I might want to increase the first stop to have a blur of 16, so it's not quite so harsh. The second one, I don't think we need nearly as much opacity. I'm going to maybe bring it down somewhere in the 20% range, I think. This blur is also too much, so I'm going to have that and see how I feel. It's looking pretty good. And I think I want it to be a little more central on the white theme since we have that top edge, and I don't want that to get lost against the background. Maybe just shift it down a little bit here. Again, this is probably done best in the context of the surrounding design. So let's drag in an instance of our reply for the white theme and see how we feel about it. All right, it's looking pretty good actually. So going back here, let's add this as a new effect style. This is elevation 3 for the white theme. And with that, I think our refined designs are actually looking pretty good here. The last thing we can do is get rid of some of this temporary work, like the inventory, and finalize the spacing of our documentation. Whew. Okay, so we finally have all of our design refinements done. Everything is componentized, and let's review our work. So if we look at our particles, we have all these design atoms that inform our spacing values, our color palette with color contrast for accessibility, and all of our type specs that we use throughout. In our atoms page, this is the bulk of our design system work. So we started with logos, created drafts of our icons, optimized those vector paths for exporting to SVG, handled notifications, avatars, timestamps, etc. And then we started getting into more interaction and statefulness with buttons and drop-down triggers that have our default hover and focus styles. We also had our tooltips, our highlights, and attachment previews. We used all of these, if we zoom to fit, to compose more and more complexity up this scale of atomic design. So we have our navigation links, icon buttons, search inputs, and then all of the recent components that we've been working on, which have quite a lot going on. So if you look at the composition of a message or this reply pane, every step along the way has made it super easy to compose new combinations of components, and we had to make less and less bespoke designs as we went. And of course, looking at these organisms, these highest levels of composition, you can see how it all comes together to make for a really refined and consistent design. The nice thing about the design system that we've created is if we ever want to retheme or redesign our application, we only have to reach down to the master instances of each of these components and do our changes there. And everything in terms of mockups and other pages and variations should adapt as needed. So this episode marks the end of the design portion of this project. But from here, what we're going to do is we're going to take these designs and build them out with HTML, CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to look out for the next episode, and we'll start diving into the development of this project.